All right. First of all, just want to welcome everybody that's out there and tuning in to this conversation. For those who don't know me, my name is Adrian Greer. I'm the executive director of My Third Place, and I'm really excited to be able to hold this conversation, especially just in light of all the things that are going on in our country. But also making sure that we're having some of these conversations to acknowledge and kind of address what does that mean for us locally. And so, Mike, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Again, for those who don't know, my heart was just moved, and I was saddened, I was angered, frustrated when I saw the video of what took place last week, with George Floyd. And I reached out to the chief and talking to him, heard some of his same frustrations, and I asked, would he be willing to have this conversation? And so grateful that you agreed. And so just to kind of spell out what's going to happen and how this is going to go down. For the first part of our conversation, we're just gonna have a dialogue. And so there's some questions that we're both going to ask each other, and then after that, we're also going to have questions that are coming in from some other folks. And so those of you who are tuning in, if you're on the My Third Place page, you'll see the comment on there that gives a link to how you would submit your questions. And you can go and click that submit questions, and we'll be answering that during our second half of our conversation. But it's mythirdplace.org/perspectives if you wanted to go ahead and fill out a question. So there also is one video question that we have that someone submitted that we'll be checking out as well. And so maybe just to kind of kick things off, we'll kind of start off with just some questions that we'll ask each other. Mike, how do you feel good about that?
Yeah, sounds good. Adrian, thank you very much for reaching out to me. Obviously, this is a really rough time for our country, and as the chief of police in the city of Azusa, it's very important for me to make sure that our community relationships are strong. And thankfully, I've known you for years, and you were able to just call me, and we have that kind of relationship. So I appreciate this. And we did have a protest in town Tuesday, and since then, there's a lot more questions that have come up, and I'm hoping to talk about that a little bit as well, because I could have very easily said, no, forget it. We're not doing this. It's too political. But I think it's more important now than it was last Saturday when you first contacted me. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. So let's kick it off with some questions.
All right. So I'm going to start with who are you? What do you do? And why do you do it?
So again, my name is Adrian, and so I'm a lifelong resident here in Azusa, and I wear kind of a couple hats at this point. So I run My Third Place, which is a nonprofit youth mentorship organization. I'm also a pastor here in town, and on top of that, I'm also on the school board. But that's not the hat that I'm wearing tonight. But why I do what I do, I think because just growing up here in Azusa, I definitely didn't always have the easiest time here in Azusa, but I was just moved. I've just fallen in love with this community, and so I just do my best to pour my heart into the community. And sometimes that's painful, and it comes in and it can be challenging. But I'm grateful to be a part of a community where there are other folks who do that same thing. So same for you. Who are you? What do you do? Why do you do it?
Okay, so. Mike Bertelson, obviously, chief for Azusa. It's been 8 months, but I've been with the city for 26 years. And I started as a jailer, and I've worked my way through the ranks to get to where I'm at right now. And I'm blessed to lead this department. And these opinions that I'm going to talk about today, these are my opinions. But at the same time, I accept the responsibility, and I understand that I represent the men and women of Azusa PD. And I want to make sure that I recognize them, because without a doubt, they're committed to providing service to the community in an unbiased way to make sure that they keep the community safe and everyone safe as best they can. But I, just a little bit about my background. I was born in Chicago. Actually moved out here to California when I was a kid, but my family's from the south side of Chicago, and I still have roots there. So, but I was raised in the San Gabriel Valley. Probably a little bit of a sheltered life, I would say, based on some of the experiences I've had as an adult. And many of those experiences came when I got hired at 21 by the Azusa Police Department. So again, thank you for the opportunity, Adrian, and thank you to everybody that's out there that is watching, listening, and willing to engage peacefully, so that, you know, hopefully we can make things better, not only in our community, but broader than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Next question. And, you know, again, this is what kind of sparked and was the impetus for me reaching out to you. What thoughts and feelings did you have when you heard about and or watched the George Floyd video? I presume that you've watched it. You've seen it.
I have, yeah. So I didn't hear about it first. I was actually, you know, on Twitter or Instagram or something, and I saw the video and clicked on it. And you know, when George Floyd was killed the way he was, I was appalled by it. You know, 26 years on the job. I've got a lot of experience. I've fought with people in the gutter. I've fought with people that were passively resisting, actively resisting, on drugs, not on drugs. I've helped and aided people with medical emergencies, and you know, it was clear watching the video what was taking place there. And George Floyd was killed on the street, and for really no reason that I could tell. You know, I would think that, you know, the officers on scene recognized what was happening, I would imagine, and whether or not they intentionally did this, I don't know, because I'm not in their minds. But I know they should have intentionally turned Mr. Floyd onto his side or sat him up so he could breathe. You know, in Azusa, we train our officers to do that, and to render medical aid and to intervene as needed. And quite frankly, I've done it where, you know, I've fought with people and had to use force, but immediately you transition into recovery mode where you're trying to help that person. And, you know, you sit them up and you pull their shoulders back and let the airways open up so that they can breathe, and you still control their legs. But you know, I was shocked by it. It reminded me of when I started my career, you know, 26 years ago when I came in. It was just after Rodney King. And, you know, I wasn't an officer. I wasn't working in law enforcement at that time. And, but for years I heard, you know, statements like, what are you gonna do? Rodney King me, and that kind of thing. And, you know, I'm not those officers, and, you know, those people aren't Rodney King. So every circumstance dictates its own course of action. And I think, at least personally, I've really worked to try to overcome those stigmas and those biases, and to try to police fairly. And, you know, when you see something like what happened in Minneapolis 2 weeks ago, I was shocked, and really, I couldn't believe we're still here. You know what I mean? 26 years later, and it's every so often you hear of something like this, but this one definitely took the wind out of my sails.
No, yeah, I can completely relate to that. I mean, so for me, when I saw that video, I think what struck me is not just that one video. You know, I think it's the kind of seemingly countless videos that I feel like I've seen, and then also my own experiences that I've lived, and just kind of wondering, you know, could that be me? You know, and what would stop that from being me? You know, this happened not that many days after the Ahmaud Arbery video came out, which was a bit different. That, you know, I know that wasn't involved, it didn't involve police, but it's just, you know, it's kind of in the same category and in the same basket of just situations where it seems like there are, you know, lives, and specifically African American males' lives who seem to be threatened and lost because of. I don't know. It breaks my heart to see, and that's where I say I was angry, I was upset, I was frustrated, and yeah, I'm grateful to be able to reach out to you, but I'm also hurt. I'm hurt that we are, still live in a country where we have to ask ourselves seriously, like, what is the racial bias that could play factor? And there's a lot of conversation even around, was that a racist cop and a black guy, or was it a good cop versus an innocent? There's a lot of conversation there, but I think that ignoring the realities of some of the bias that exists and some of the prejudice that exists, not only in all of us, but then also in situations when you have officers who are making some of these split second decisions, it just continues to make me at times fearful from my own life when I find myself in some of these situations.
Yeah, I understand, and it really, I mean, it is about police and interaction with police, but at the same time, it is a broader conversation that I think the nation needs to have. And if I knew what the answer was, I'd be retired and we'd be on the mend. But
Sure.
it's so complex that I think having conversations like this is a great first step, and there's much more work to be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay, what thoughts and feelings do you have about protesting and rioting going on around the country?
Yeah, this is an interesting. I mean, I know this is another one of those things that can be extremely polarizing. So one, I'm grateful to live in a country where we have a right to protest, and I think that there are times and situations that come about where I think as Americans, like, we should. I think it's our duty to speak up and make it be known that this is that we're against some of injustices that are out there. And so my thoughts around the protesting, I totally get it. I'm completely for it. I recognize also that unfortunately we see a lot of protests that get ugly. A lot of protests that start out as peaceful protests and people exercising their rights, and then that turn into rioting and destruction and looting and all kind of other stuff. And I guess I got to say that breaks my heart to see that happen. I think that in no way, in zero way, would I condone or excuse some of that destruction that happens. I think I where I'm able to empathize, where I'm able to understand is, if there's a group of people who are feeling like I've tried everything, we've tried to peacefully protest in these ways, and have been communicated, no, we've tried to use legal recourse and we've tried these things, and yet nothing happens. And so the anger and the rage that comes out of that, the outrage that comes from that, I guess I'm not surprised to see people react in that way and respond in that way. I don't think it's helpful. I think it's certainly harmful. I think there's even countless situations of people who have lost their lives, in these riots. And those, I'm somebody who believes that, that those each and every one of these lives are valuable, and to see those lives lost are heartbreaking as well. So protesting, I'm all for it. But the rioting and just the destruction and the subsequent death that comes from that, it breaks my heart as well.
Yeah, and same question to me. I agree. Although I didn't serve in the military, my dad did, my grandfather has, family members have, and they fought for the right to be able to, exercise the First Amendment and to protest peacefully. And as a police officer, that is one of my fundamental things that I'm sworn to do, is to uphold the Constitution. So peaceful protests, I am grateful to be able to have people exercise those rights. And I think that it can be healthy, and it can start conversations like this. And hopefully 2020 has been a rough year with the COVID and everything, but maybe the second half of 2020 can be a positive year, and maybe some changes can start taking place that are overdue. But with the rioting, that's really a concern, right? And you kind of hit it on the head that people get angry, and it may be organic and spark, and they just it happens. It's an emotional release. But quite frankly, a lot of the stuff that I think has been taking place is not that. I think it's people taking advantage of the situation and just going out to try to loot and steal and cause destruction. And the sad thing about that is that the true message and the true reason for the protest gets lost, right? And the concern is at that point, why are people, breaking in and stealing shoes and that kind of thing, and how, as law enforcement, do we respond to that and try to address those issues? And I guess this might be a good place to talk about the protest that we had here in Azusa on Tuesday, right? So we had received some information from social media. We saw that there was a protest coming to town. We reached out and tried to contact the protest organizer by social media. We got no response. And ultimately, they were meeting at a local park. Our officers went down, spoke to people at the park, trying to identify, hey, who's the organizer? What's the plan? What do you want us to help you do? And nobody owned it. Nobody said, yeah, this is my protest. So one of our local leaders stepped up and kind of led the group up and into City Hall lawn. And our hope really was, with the presence of law enforcement there. Last weekend's protests were very violent. Everybody saw it on TV across the nation. There were buildings being burned and looting and rioting and damage and all of that. So our concern was, is that going to be the protest that we see in Azusa? And if it's at City Hall, how do we protect City Hall? How do we facilitate a safe spot for people to be able to exercise their First Amendment right? One of the comments I keep hearing is, oh, there were snipers on the roof with guns pointed at us. Well, as law enforcement leaders, we look at all possibilities. And if there's a protest going on, that's a large group of people and they could be a potential target, right? You look at what happened in Las Vegas a couple of years ago with the Route 91 concert, right? And a mass shooting that took place there. You look at, and quite frankly, in Azusa, we had a marathon a couple of years ago where we had somebody pull up on some runners that he came out with an assault rifle, right? And pointed it at him. So it wasn't to scare the crowd. It wasn't to make people uncomfortable. It's really Overwatch to try to keep people safe, both the protesters so they can exercise their First Amendment rights and the officers that were out there, providing the protection. So, and I completely understand. And quite frankly, I called a couple of our local leaders and said, hey, just so you know, when you come up and you come across Foothill, you're going to see a police presence, right? Because we're not sure what's going to take place. And we want to make sure that everybody, has an opportunity to be there, but it's a safe environment. And it's a fine line, right? Do you put officers out in riot gear and have a skirmish line and try to establish, look, we have a plan and communicate we have a plan in place, so please don't start heaving rocks or whatever through windows at City Hall? Or do you have those officers stay back and just let a group that could potentially turn into a mob go into City Hall? So we tried to weigh those, tried to look at the intelligence that was available. We looked at the protests leading up to that event on Tuesday, and we tried to take a stance that would communicate, look, we have a plan, we're here, take the City Hall lawn and protest all day long if you would like, right? Some people did not like the fact that the officers were there. I actually had people come up and talk to me and say, hey, why do you have, an armored vehicle here? Why are the officers in riot gear? And they came up to me and spoke to me while I was at the protest with them. And I told them, look, if something bad happens, you plan for the worst, hope for the best, right? If something bad happens, I can't say time out, let my officers go put their helmets on, right? We have to go get our gear on. We can't do that. And everybody, I think, understands that, And then the there was a part of the protest group that broke off and went into the community and started walking down the roadways. And, they walked for, I don't know, maybe a mile, 2 miles, whatever it was, tried to get up on the freeway, is my understanding, to shut down the freeway. And ultimately, I was monitoring it. I was nearby, shadowing the group, and my officers that were on scene said, "Hey, they're in traffic. It's unsafe for them. It's unsafe for our motorists that are trying to drive down the road." And so the decision was made to give a dispersal order. And then ultimately, and so, we don't take that lightly, right? We want people to be able to protest, and we want people to be able to exercise their voice and let themselves be heard. And ultimately, we blocked roadways and tried to provide a way for them to get back to the park where they had parked their vehicles, which I think we did. But along the way, people were dispersing and, going into the community. So as with any other operation, we have a debrief after any event like that. We talk about what we did well, what we didn't do well, what can be changed. We're still watching intelligence and trying to figure out, okay, what's going on. And, since Tuesday, the protests regionally and nationally have changed, I think. It's not the looting and the rioting and the fires that we saw last weekend, right? This week, it seems like it's a different tone. I think people are ready to have conversations like this and ready to start putting in work. And, we stand with the community. We want to move things forward, and just make it better where we can. And quite frankly, that, there's a whole lot of perspective that you have, Adrian, and others that we don't, and that's why I think it's important to really look forward and try to move forward. And, but also understand I've got a job to do to protect the community and to protect protesters that might be in the roadway and whatnot. So, yeah. Sorry if that was long-winded.
No, that was good. And there's actually a couple questions that we have about that specifically in a moment. So we'll get right back to that one. Just a couple of other things that I want to make sure that we talk about before that, though, is this next one. I know that there's a phrase that has kind of gone around and it's become an extremely polarizing phrase. And for whatever reason, when people hear it, there are things that it conjures up. And so I'm curious to know, when you hear the phrase Black Lives Matter, what thoughts and emotions are conjured up for you?
Okay. So, if you take it at its root, Black Lives Matter, I agree, right? It is, that is fundamentally true. And, I always think to counter that with all lives matter, right? There's an organization, Black Lives Matter, and it's kind of a loosely, and I don't know that it's a formal organization necessarily, but a lot of people just put a hashtag Black Lives Matter and they're part of it, right? That's how organic it is, and that's how important it is to people. For me, I always try to be, for lack of a better description, be colorblind and to try to do my job where, quite frankly, I don't care what your race is. If you're a crook, you're a crook. Whether you're, black, white, Latino, whatever it is. But, the more I reflect on it, maybe that's short-sighted, possibly. I've got African-American friends, and some of the conversations I have with them, some of the things they tell me, it never would occur to me, some of the experiences that they have. And not necessarily, not specifically with law enforcement, but with other African-Americans and just in their culture, for lack of a better description. So, to me, all lives matter. But in this context, I think Black Lives Matter. And I don't want to sell it short because I think there is room for me to have a better understanding of it. Because like I said, when I talk to my buddies and you don't understand, let me explain this to you. And I'm like, oh man, it wouldn't even occur to me as a white person, it wouldn't even occur to me. And I don't know. And I think that's where we need more growth and conversation, right? So that on both sides, we understand each other's perspective better.
Yeah. So no, I hear that. And so, and even to kind of share, when, like I said, looking at what happened, these videos that were kind of released and circulated over the course of these past few weeks, and even just experiences like Breonna Taylor and other things where we just see examples of situations where, kind of, it would cause people to question, do Black Lives Matter? And so the fact that people are kind of shouting out and declaring that, and then to be met with, I just want to share this, like the thoughts or the perspective of being told when someone says Black Lives Matter, and then being told in response to that as as a rebuttal that all lives matter. There's pain that comes from that as well. I understand, me being somebody who would also recognize and declare that Black Lives Matter and recognize that all lives matter, but it's like that's not what's being talked about. I heard somebody kind of give an example and say, if you had, if you had 4 children, and one of your children was harmed or was hurting or was in pain, you might go and say to that child, I love you, and you might go and comfort and speak to that one child. You wouldn't necessarily say, well, but I love all. You still do love all your kids, but there in that moment, this is what we're talking. This is what's being addressed, and this is what's being talked about. And so, it's just the thought, and I hear people say it as if that what they hear when people say Black Lives Matter, it's almost like they're hearing someone say, only Black Lives Matter and your life doesn't, which is not what that says. And you're right. It's a hashtag, and because people use a hashtag, people engage in behavior and attach that hashtag to that behavior that is not helpful. But I don't understand. To me, it's unfortunate that that's a polarizing phrase. To me, it's unfortunate that people can't easily just say Black Lives Matter and leave it at that. And when it's time for a conversation to speak about other lives that matter, let's talk about that, and let's step up and acknowledge that. But yeah, it's painful when and frustrating when all lives matter comes back as a response. I wasn't there at the very beginning of the protest, and so I can't speak to firsthand experience around this, but so I don't know how helpful it is for me to kind of share through the grapevine information. But it's my understanding that there was even that there might have been an officer that was there and kind of spoke to some of the folks there in the beginning, and kind of communicating that there's not going to be riots, or there's we don't want to have, let's peacefully protest, kind of to sign off from that. It's my understanding that the officer said, and all lives matter. And it's just like it just feels like it misses the point. It feels like, again, we recognize that, but right now the emotion, the feeling, the sense is that I don't know that my life matters in some of these situations. And so for me to declare and to say that Black Lives Matter, and for that not to be recognized and affirmed, or to be rebutted, is frustrating. So
yeah, I understand that. Naturally, I've never heard the analogy you gave about the 4 kids, and if somebody's hurt, that you would go to that kid and comfort them, and that's really enlightening. That's I think that's where growth comes, right? I don't have your experiences. I'm not living day to day the way that you do and that other African Americans do, and so I don't know some of those feelings that you're feeling. Yeah. So, I think that's where, we need to move forward together and try to help each other understand that, because, I don't want to be somebody that, rebuts with something that makes you feel even worse, if that makes sense. That's not the goal. The goal should be, hey, how are we inclusive? How are we empathetic, and how do we help Adrian and others know, no, you do matter, obviously. So,
I appreciate that, and even to speak to that, because I think we live in a country where we tend to be put into categories, and sometimes we're told, almost led to believe that there's this false dichotomy of you if you're for this, then you got to be against that, and I just want to make sure that that I'm clear about this, because a lot of times people will say are you on the Black Lives Matter side or the rebuttal? So you might hear things like, Blue Lives Matter, or you might hear, things like that, as if these things are juxtaposed. And so I want to communicate, maybe everybody wouldn't agree with me on this, and there's dynamic perspective within the Black experience, but it is not my goal to be against police. There were some people even at this protest, and I'll share about this in a moment, on Tuesday, that were kind of shouting out, really harmful things, and violent things about police officers, and that's not my perspective either. And so I want to be able to declare that Black Lives Matter. It would be beautiful to have police stand behind that, and other folks stand behind that. And then in the same case, when there are folks that would be communicating that the life of an officer doesn't matter, or the life of other people don't matter, that we can all stand behind that as well, and like you said, move forward. And I look forward to even having future conversations with you about this, and kind of seeing where we can learn from each other's perspectives.
Outstanding. Describe your experiences and feelings during a typical police stop.
So yeah, this is interesting. So for me, I am a law-abiding citizen. I follow the laws. I have the documentation that I need in my car, and my insurance. I have these things in place, and yet I have to acknowledge, and it's colored by I have had some horrible experiences with police officers, and I don't I want to be clear. I'm not saying that was only or exclusively here in the city of Azusa. I gotta say I've had some pretty rough experiences, and so whenever I get pulled over, it could be for anything. I recognize that I become really tense. I think typically I maybe come across as a relatively confident person. In those moments when I get stopped by a police officer just on the road, there's fear that sets in, and there's a belief, and there's an understanding that this interaction where I got stopped, I don't even I might not even known what I've done, and that there's this fear that I recognize that one wrong move could mean that my life is over. And so what I tend to do, I feel the need, and this has kind of been ingrained to me as I've been growing up, is to overcompensate. I roll down all of my windows. I put my hands on 10 and 2. I don't make any moves without permission, without asking, and even then, at times, I'm not met with pleasant officers all the time. Sometimes I am, but there's because I'm nervous, I sound nervous, and I wonder if me sounding nervous makes me come across as suspicious, and am I being evaluated as being suspicious, which then makes me seem more suspicious. And the whole, and the process just kind of creates this entire cycle. I also recognize that I don't have to roll my windows down. I don't have to keep my hands at 10. I have the rights and I have protections, but I'm afraid for my life in some of these situations, and so that's how I respond. And I guess it breaks my heart that I and so many of buddies who I speak to who look like me share some of these same examples and same feelings when they find themselves in these situations. And I don't know how we come about that. I know a lot of the officers here in Azusa, and so I feel a bit more safe because I have some relationships here in Azusa that those haven't been my experiences. But by and large, a lot of times I have to acknowledge, no, I do feel and experience fear.
Okay. Well, my perspective on it, I'm going to give you two perspectives,
yeah.
Right? I'm going to give you my perspective as a motorist, right? Because I get stopped by the police too.
Sure.
It's been a while, knock on wood, but I do get stopped, and I do the same, Adrian. I roll the windows down. I keep my hands visible at all times. I've got a son that drives, and I talked with him, said, dude, this is what you need to do, right? And I know it's a different dynamic because you're Black and I'm not, right? So there's implicit bias that might be there that puts you in a different position than maybe I am when you're being contacted by an officer. Let me give you the officer perspective, right? So traffic stop, if I walk up on a car where the windows are down and their hands are at 10 and 2, that makes me much, much more comfortable because I can immediately see into the back seat of the car. I can see if there's anybody in there, with a gun, or if there's kids there, or I can see the hands, right? Because really nothing else is going to hurt me. It's the hands that are going to hurt me. So if I walk up and your hands are up here, it makes me more comfortable. But traffic stops as an officer are very nerve wracking. If it's night, you can't see into the car. You don't know, did this person that you're pulling over just do a robbery down the street, or just do a shooting down the street, or what if, or are they just grandma going home? You really don't know until you get up there and kind of make contact. Especially with tinted windows, it makes much more complex sometimes. So traffic stops for officers, it's something we train on a lot. In the academy, we train on it a lot. And we, really try to be as safe as we can. Because quite frankly, we're people and we don't want to be injured. Right. And, sometimes I hear, well, why did the officer have to have his hand on the gun? Like when he was talking to the person. Well, sometimes I put my hand on my gun when I'm walking up on the car, not necessarily pulling it out, but like if I can't see in and it's, depending on the circumstances, I might do that. Sometimes I don't. It just depends. And they're difficult. But after doing them for a period of time, you become comfortable with it. And it might just be personality of officer as well. It could be interactions of that officer throughout their career. It could be the community they work in, whatever it is. I'm pretty easygoing, and I try to be friendly, and I try to talk with folks and interact. And even on a traffic stop, I try to be as polite as I can because it makes it easier for everybody, right? If you're getting stopped, it's like the worst. It's like the worst day, right? You're having a bad day. You're getting stopped by the police. To add in the complexities of race and how that plays into things. And, it just makes it that much more complicated, really on both sides. Right. So.
Can you speak into that? I mean, even as a police officer, I mean, ways that you maybe have seen or recognized, whether it's historically or now, where racial bias, plays a factor in policing?
Well, I can give you I'll give you an example, right? Maybe this shed some light on things. So, if I've pulled traffic stops in for years, right? And if I stop a car, oftentimes I don't even know who's in the car. I don't know what race they are. I don't, just depends, right? But it's interesting sometimes because I've stopped cars with African-American drivers in it, and the hands come out the window, right? They literally stick their hands out the window. And to me, the first time I saw that, I was shocked. I was like, what is this? Like, why are they doing that? And I think it's just in response to what you're describing and the feelings that you have when you get stopped by police, and the fact that they're just trying to get through the traffic stop without being injured or without having something bad happen to them, and I don't know where that's learned, if it's from, family ties, if it's from, maybe the community that they live in, that's what the officers tell them they need to do. Frankly, I don't know. But that's an example to it. Again, to me, I have always strived to really not let race play into it. If you're a crook, you're a crook. And, but that's not to say there's not something there. There could be.
Yeah.
But I try to be conscious of it and aware of it, and to counter it if it is there.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And I'll just make note because I know a little bit earlier you talked about how you try to be colorblind,
Yeah.
and I understand how that applies as an officer. Maybe that can be one of those a future, when things get a little open up, or it can be a future conversation that we can sit around some coffee and just talk around some of the complexities of maybe appropriate levels of color blindness if you're a police officer, and where you're talking about not being biased, but also being conscious of that, and also how color blindness can also be another one of those polarizing topics as well, and where well-meaning people sometimes communicate color blindness, where it can also communicate and it can be harmful as well. But I'd love to, and I know you'd be open for that, to have a conversation.
That's what this is about, Adrian. Is let's talk. Let's talk
Absolutely.
and work through it, and hopefully grow from it.
Absolutely. Okay, I want to kind of transition here a little bit because, and I know that we spent some time. Thank you for sharing about the protest this last Tuesday, and we got ahead of things a little bit because there's actually a video question that came in from actually someone who I've known here that's grown up here in Azusa my whole life. I know that she kind of sent in some questions to PD on social media, and then we got in contact, and so I have a video that I want to play where she's going to kind of share some of her thoughts from Tuesday's protests, and then she has a couple questions, one for you and then one for officers in general. So let me cue this up.
Hello, Chief Bertelsen. First of all, thank you for taking the time to listen and respond to the concerns in our community. My name is Angelica Benavides, and I was born and raised in Azusa, and I've seen the city evolve over the years. Professionally, I am a teacher, and my siblings are educators, police officers, and social workers. I'm a person who truly respects law enforcement, and I believe that their job is to serve and protect. There are a couple of questions I'd like to ask you, but before I get to those questions, I want to preface them by explaining where I think there might be some issues. On the day of the protest, I understand that the Azusa Police Department did what they had to do to protect the safety of motorists and protesters by dispersing the crowd and pointing out that it was an unlawful assembly. I believe that Azusa PD anticipated what could happen in the worst case scenario and demonstrated their preparation on that day by highlighting their power rather than showing solidarity with protesters. It did not actually appear that we had peace officers on that day. The protesting that's happening right now in our nation is not about an us versus them. It's about finding the we, acknowledging the humanity in every single person, and working together to build the best possible community. Chief, I have to point out that my feeling is that many of the officers working for the Azusa Police Department are simply not very approachable. I rarely see an officer smile at civilians when they patrol our streets. I feel that many officers in our community fear the people of Azusa, and many people in our city fear the officers. I really want this to change. On the day of the protest, there were officers with riot gear. There were what appeared to be snipers wielding their armed weapons in front of protesters. We're a small community, but this was a very big response. You really appeared to demonstrate your power. I believe that such a response from Azusa PD only demonstrates the lack of understanding between the community and law enforcement. And as we all know, any decision driven by fear will only beget fear. My questions for you, Chief Bertelsen, and the local Azusa Police Department are, what do you think we can do to build a better, more confident relationship with our local law enforcement? And a second question I have is for officers. What do you think you can do to make yourselves more approachable to the average Azusa citizen? Thank you so much for taking the time to listen and to respond, and I look forward to dialoguing with you.
So I know that we kind of talked about some of this a little bit already, but again, maybe you can respond to some of the other nuances and things that Angie was asking about.
Sure. So again, I appreciate her being candid and the input of it. And, it was regarding the protest on Tuesday, it was something that we considered, okay, how much of a presence do we have? What are we going to do? What kind of a response are we going to have? And based on what we knew that day, we deployed the assets and resources we did in a way that we thought would be effective. It's a fine line. Like I mentioned earlier, some people were happy to see that, and they were happy to have the officers present. And some people are not happy to see that, and they think that it just instills a response that makes people fearful of the police. And that's obviously not our goal. Our goal is to provide safety for everybody. So I think we've covered that. And then, one of the questions is, what do you think we can do to build better and more confident relationships with local law enforcement? And, I want to share kind of some of the community outreach we do, and much of it is related to, we do a lot of social media work. I don't do it all myself. There's no way I could do it all myself. I have a team of social media members that try to push out our messaging and interact with the community as much as we can. We also do a variety of community events, whether it's burgers with badges, or coffee with a cop, or things that we sponsor, National Night Out, those sorts of things. And we always try to encourage the community to come out and meet with us and talk with us. And on the kind of the other side of that is one of the things that I value and hold as one of the best parts of my job, actually, is going out to community meetings and talking with people and having an opportunity to interact with the community, right? And that could be a request for a neighborhood watch meeting. That could be come out to a HOA and talk. That could be, come to the school and meet with teachers and staff. And I can't think of a time when I have said, no, we're not doing that, because I think that is so critically important for us to build those confident relationships, right? And I've, since becoming chief, I've really tried to instill in my staff, hey, this is something that I think is very important to us, to build those community relationships so that people get to know us, and we can have those solid relationships where somebody can just pick up the phone and call, hey, I got to talk to you about this. I want to pick your brain, or that kind of thing. So I really think if we continue to do that, and maybe even find some new mechanisms to have conversations, I think that will help bridge some of those gaps and build some of those bridges, I guess. Yeah. Like we're talking about some of the things that you and I will meet on and discuss further. I think that just needs to happen at a broader scale, maybe. I don't know Angie. I've never met Angie that I can recall. I don't know if she's ever come to any of our community events or anything like that. I would encourage her and others, like, if you see something where the PD is having an event, come out, talk to us. Like, we're people. We are there to support the community. We're there to provide service where we can. And I think that's probably one of the best mechanisms. Her second question was, what can officers do to make themselves more approachable to an average Azusan citizen? So I'll tell you two things. So with these community events that I just finished describing, I always try to include several different officers, right? I talk about bringing different command staff people out. I talk about bringing different detectives out, different officers out, different members of the social media team, because I think it's an opportunity for the community to meet different members of the police department, but also for members of the police department to get out and have conversations and just be normal around people and talk to them and that kind of thing. I think that will help with some of those relationships. The PD does a lot of training in cultural diversity and bias-based policing and how to remain impartial. And when we train officers in our FTO program, like, that's part of the conversation, is to be friendly. And one of the tenets I use is police the community like you want your community policed, right? If if your grandma is standing out on the front lawn, you expect a cop to come by and wave at her, right? Or say hello, or at least not look angry, right? And so I encourage our officers to do that. So I think it's probably just along the lines of having more communication and more opportunities for interaction. And looking to the future, I'm going to be trying to find ways to create more opportunities for that interaction, both at my level and the line level officer level as well. I don't know. Do you think that addressed it, Adrian? I mean,
no, I think, yeah, no, I think that does. And I know I got to speak with Angie a little bit and even talking through like, what are some of the forward things, that we're able to do, which is, I'm grateful that she brought those questions forward. Also, just kind of talking about the example and just the situation that happened this last week with or earlier this week with the protest. Just to kind of share my experience. So I got there. I wasn't there at Slauson Park. I got there at City Hall once the crowd had already made its way there. And I'll say that I immediately recognized. I mean, just like the row. I don't know what I expected, but I don't think that I expected that. And so it definitely kind of created like a jolted response from me, and it definitely made me feel tense. I don't feel like I was, necessarily a target there, but I similar to how Angie was describing, it didn't feel like, in the same way that we look at the video of what happened with George Floyd, where so many of us, I think maybe even police officers, even more so, because they recognize like the bad rap and the bad name that police officers get because of behavior in videos like that. There didn't seem to be that same level of solidarity to say like, we're with you and we're upset and we're in essence have a job to do, but in protest as well of those things. It did feel very, it felt us and them, and that was alarming. It's something that I noticed. And I just wonder, like, what does that do to set the tone? And so how do we, if that was the beginning, and then as things kind of progressed, I know like the group kind of split off and started walking down the street. And even I was curious, I didn't know what was going on or how it was going. And so I continued to walk down there with the group. And I saw people kind of, crossing the street. I saw some folks like kind of getting in, stopping. There was a car that got stopped, and some of the people in the crowd were engaging with the people in the car, and same thing. I mean, there were shouts and just, I mean, kind of things that were shouted and said that I wasn't proud to hear shouted. I'll say that I have to tip my hat to many of your officers, because there were things that were shouted out at them. And for the most part, they held their composure. And that's something that I noticed. I mean, when I heard some of the things that they're being yelled at right in their face, and that they were kind of taking it, that I was struck and I am impressed by that to a degree, but that didn't happen across the board. There definitely were instances and circumstances where I saw some officers kind of responding back in ways that were disappointing to see officers respond back, that I think do not de-escalate the situation, but only continue to escalate the situation. I would say that things got to a place where, there at the end, I think it was a good thing that things were dispersed, because it felt very volatile to me. It felt like if there was a wrong move on either side of this thing, then this could get real bad real quick. And so I guess that's part of the challenge. Like, even the way that I'm viewing it, it felt like it was an either side thing, as opposed to some of our police within that is part of our community, in a way, joining in to stand against some of the injustices that we saw happening. So there were ways that it felt us and them, the community and the police. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think that there are typically great, some good relationships and great things that go on between Azusa police and the rest of the community. And Tuesday to me felt like a bit of a missed opportunity to stand in unity together.
Well, I appreciate that. And I know you and I spoke after, and quite frankly, that's part of my debrief with the staff that were involved with planning it and trying to figure out what we did well and didn't do well. And the feedback about, most officers holding their composure and doing well, and a few not. That is filtered out, and that's unacceptable. Like, our job is to sit there, and it's not fun, it's not easy, but if we got to take it, we got to take it. If there's no violence occurring, there's no rioting, that kind of thing. So it doesn't help anybody. It's very similar to go back to the traffic stop scenario, right? Everybody's on edge. The officer's on edge because they don't know what's in the car. The person in the car is on edge because they don't know what the officer's thinking or doing. And if it's tense and you're able to get through it, and neither side kind of chips at each other, it makes it easier for everybody. I always have tried to show respect where it was earned. And if it's not earned, okay, well, then I'll take a different tone with you. But for the most part, if I approach up and say, hey, how are you, whatever, it's very helpful. In a situation like on Tuesday, and again, I wasn't walking with the group. I wasn't part of that. I monitored it and shadowed it from a couple of blocks away. And to me, it just seemed tense, and officers, if they chip back, they shouldn't have, quite frankly. And but at the same time, it's difficult for their people. And when you have people yelling things in your face, and some of the things that you heard, it can be difficult.
Yeah. So yeah, and with that, I guess I look forward to. You can't these things aren't planned. Nobody expected what happened over the past couple of weeks, with George Floyd to happen, and then just the outrage and outcry that's happened since. It's difficult to plan for these things, but my hope would be that we're able to learn from this situation, learn from this moment, and just ask ourselves, how can we handle these things, again, peacefully, but also in solidarity, recognizing that as our police here in the community, one of the things that our police do for us is protecting our rights to protest. And so I just wonder, can there be greater levels of communication, or can there be other things that we consider to do to kind of ease some of that tension? I look forward to figuring that out.
Yeah, and I think there are, quite frankly. I mean, so there is another protest planned tomorrow coming up, and that organizer has reached out to us. We've talked with him, and we know kind of what his intent and what his plan is, and we are adjusting accordingly, right? And we're going to help facilitate that and allow him to him and his fellow protesters to occupy the front lawn of City Hall and to protest all they want, and hopefully facilitate that without the us versus them, because I don't want that, right? Yeah. That's not what this is about.
Yeah, neither
it should be a feel of police supporting people in their exercising of the First Amendment rights. The hard part is, though, when and I'll be frank, there are people from outside the community that came in that they were not here for that. They were here to, in many people's assessment, not just law enforcement, but many people's assessment, to stir things up and cause problems in Azusa. And we don't want that. Nobody wants that. The community members don't want that. We want to have a good partnership. We want to be able to support people while they go out and safely protest, because it really comes back to the issues and how are we going to stand together to move forward.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can continue to work in that direction.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Look forward to that. Kind of want to pivot a little bit and talk about some policy things. And so we'll talk a little bit here, and then after this, we'll open up and allow for some people to see what questions have come in. Are you familiar with the 8 Can't Wait and or the Campaign Zero policy changes that are kind of circulating around?
I am. So it's just been a couple of days that I've seen this and heard of this. And so I've read through them. I've got it in front of me. And I'm
gonna share this from this is the 8 Can't Wait site.
Okay.
And so again, it's talking about eight policies that data shows that together these eight policies can decrease police killings by 72%. And so I see ban chokeholds and strangleholds, require de-escalation, require warning before shooting, requires exhaust all alternatives before shooting, duty to intervene. Other officers kind of seeing that, ban shooting at moving vehicles, require use of force continuum, and also require comprehensive reporting. And so I know that there are a lot of communities that are looking at this, and there's a push. And same thing, we have the Campaign Zero, which has its own set as well. And so these are policy, kind of suggestions that are kind of making their way around. And so I'm curious to know if you are familiar with these. Are there any of these that we already have in place that we can speak to? And then I'm also curious to know which of these can we begin to work towards, and also just your general thoughts around these policy suggestions.
Okay, so speaking to the ones, and I have the 8 can't wait list in front of me. So. First of all, I think we can work with all of this, right? But it needs to be much clearer and much more thought out than just what's there, right? So the icons that are listed on the websites that you just showed, like it's 3 words. Like you can't develop policy and change to procedure with just 3 words, right? So hopefully there's much more robust conversation behind it or to be had.
And there is, if you go on there and click through, you'll
I'm sure.
Okay, but that's the brief description.
So, and in looking at these, we do have many of these things already in place, not only with Azusa PD as a matter of policy, but broader law enforcement, and really all law enforcement in the state of California is governed by post, and our policies, it's peace officer standards and training. And all of our standards come out of post, and then of course governed by law as well. But I'm just going to go 1 through 8 if you're okay with it, and just speak to it.
Sure.
So the first one is require officers to de-escalate situations where possible instead of resorting to force. We absolutely do that and encourage people to do that, and like that has always been part of law enforcement, right? We don't just show up and start hitting people and using force, right? At least we don't train that way. There may be officers that do that, but overwhelmingly, that's not the case. We have that in place already. 2 is require officers to report each time they use or threaten to use force against civilians. We already require officers to report anytime they use force. I don't know that it is required that they report anytime they threaten to use force, because one of the things that we do is, as an officer, is you have command presence. You show up, and is one person's interpretation of a skirmish line in front of the city hall a threat to use force, and do we report that? It's a very fine nuance, but if there's actual, at least at this point, if there's actual force that's used, it's required to be reported. We actually have a use of force review process that we put everything through.
Does that include, because I know one of the things it talks about is even if the act of pointing a gun at someone is even listed here. Is that something that's required to be reported in the event that happens?
We don't require that at this point. No. Although most circumstances where you're going to point a gun, there's, I'm sure, probably going to be report generated and it would be listed in there. But I can't say that it's an absolute, yes, that's what we do or don't do. And again, these are things that I think we being law enforcement can work with. We just have to have further conversation.
And this is a start, right?
Yeah. I didn't see this until, what is today, the 6th?
Yeah.
3 days ago.
Yeah.
So,
Sure.
And then, so number 3, exhaust all means before shooting. Face value, that sounds very realistic. Like you want to exhaust all means. I think what needs to be worked out is who's going to determine what means needed to be exhausted, right? Because with 26 years of law enforcement experience, my experiences are much different than, say, you, right? So if I arrive on a scene of an incident, I may move to a different level of force quicker or slower than you might, just based on my level of training and experience, if that makes sense. So I think we do that anyways, and we try through whether it's communication or de-escalation or even a threat to use force, we try to not use force and exhaust everything we can before we would have to shoot somebody. No, I don't know any officers, and I know I don't go to work thinking, oh, I'm going to shoot somebody today. That would not be the goal, obviously. Require officers to intervene and stop excessive force used by other officers. We absolutely do that, and that's my expectation of the officers in Azusa and anywhere. And if you go back to the incident with George Floyd, like I'm shocked and disappointed that like there were 4 cops there. Somebody should have stepped in and intervened, said, "Hey, move, get off of him." It's that simple, and that didn't take place. So yes, we do that.
Are there consequences that are baked in, like in the event that an officer doesn't?
Yes.
What might those consequences be?
Yeah. So I mean, if there's excessive force taking place and an officer doesn't intervene, we do a use of force review. If it's deemed to be excessive force or outside of the policy or procedures or the law, we do an internal affairs investigation, and those officers would be investigated and held accountable.
And also to be clear, so that happens internally. I know that even looking at the Campaign Zero, one of the things that it talks about is having community police, community that are involved in some of those, and having outside entities that are reviewing that. That's not how that happens here within our community.
In Azusa, no. Yeah, most jurisdictions I don't think have that in place. Maybe some larger agencies have like police review boards, that kind of thing. But most smaller jurisdictions do not. We navigate that process through officers and usually command level people that were not involved in the incident, if that makes sense. Require warning before shooting is one of them, and that sounds great. Like face value, yeah, like warn them before you're going to shoot. And I would say most instances we do that. We try to. But the thing that comes to mind for me is we had an active shooter situation in Azusa in November of 2016, and if it was mandated that those officers issued a warning before firing shots, like either officers or innocent civilians, more of them could have been killed. So I don't know that we can make a hard and fast, you have to warn. Of course, try to use all means to exercise the best judgment, but there are circumstances where it may not be feasible. Develop force continuum that limits the types of force and or weapons that can be used to respond to specific types of resistance. So we do have a force continuum right now, and it's depending on the level of resistance, what kind of force we use, and it may be just a verbal. I may raise my tone of voice and try to overcome resistance in those terms. I may just have to put somebody's hands behind their back, or I may there's different levels, and we use the level of force based on the circumstances that we're trying to overcome, right? And that is all dictated by law, obviously. Now, I don't know that we could impose a level of force specifically tied to a level of resistance. I don't know that you can say, okay, if somebody's punching me, I can only punch them, because I have to be able to use enough force to overcome what's taking place. I represent, the law, and if I'm there, there's a reason I'm there. The community has asked me to be there. It would be difficult to say, yeah, you can only use this level of force for a certain thing. There is a continuum in place. We do only use that force necessary to overcome whatever resistance we're experiencing. Ban shooting at moving vehicles. It's a dangerous but largely ineffective tactic. And we have not banned shooting at vehicles, but this is absolutely correct. It is dangerous and typically ineffective. But again, are you going to, do we ban shooting at a vehicle? And if an officer is at an incident and a vehicle is driving at them, and the only means to try to stop an assault, or say there's a vehicle driving at a group of protesters, and the only means to try to stop that vehicle is to shoot at the moving vehicle, like, do we ban that and say you cannot do that? And then the officer, if he does do it, gets held accountable and prosecuted or fired because he was trying to help people not get driven into. Like, that's how like, it's such a fine nuance to try to figure out what's the best language to try to implement some of these changes if they're going to be changed moving forward. Ban chokeholds, strangleholds in cases where less lethal force could be used. Azusa PD, we train in the LVNR, which is a lateral vascular neck restraint. Chokehold, stranglehold is a different kind of hold. We do not train that. We do not authorize officers to use that. And again, if we say you absolutely cannot use that, and an officer is in a fight for his life, and the only technique that he can do is to use a chokehold, does the officer lose his life at that point? Because if he uses it, he's going to get in trouble. Or do we recognize that sometimes law enforcement and the job we do is very violent, and unfortunately, there are fights that take place. We don't allow that as a restraint technique. But if an officer is fighting for their life, do we take that tool away from them, if that makes sense? So, and I understand, Adrian, and to everybody listening and watching, like, this is really kind of the crux of it, right? That officer knelt on George Floyd's neck, and that contributed to him dying. So how do we remove that so that doesn't happen again? And I can tell you, and I'll share with you, that we do not train to kneel on people's necks. Like, we don't do that. That's not a technique that is trained at any law enforcement academy that I'm aware of anywhere. And I know at Azusa PD, obviously we don't train in those techniques. So I think there is room for growth and room for change, and I'm sure there's going to be change coming. I just need to, I encourage responsible change, and let's make sure that the men and women that really the community of Azusa and nationwide law enforcement and society has said, hey, we need you here because we need you to respond when we need you, and we need you to keep us safe and keep us protected. Like, let's keep those people protected too, and let's make sure we have responsible legislation to make sure it's regulated, make sure it's watched, make sure that we don't use excessive force, but also make sure that they can do their job and overcome the resistance that they might need to, so that they can go home at the end of their shift to their families.
Yeah, no, and I hear that, and even I more recently also was made aware of some of these things, and there's even a spot here, like on this website, where you can kind of see where your city stands with some of these things. Azusa is not listed in there. I think something I would love to see is, how can we have some conversation? Let me say this, as a school board member, I recognize that, I sit in the role of representing other people. And I think similar, in the police, force is here, and they are the community's police force, and they are for the community. And so when, what are those ways in which the community is able to speak into some of the practices and some of the policies and some of the things that go on, because some of these decisions can be made, at a department level. Some of them require, a city council to vote and to speak into some of these things. Some of these are maybe state and or federal legislation that comes through and may call for some of these, these things. I guess I wonder, what does it look like for us as we move forward to let this be the beginning of a conversation to see what are the needs of Azusa, and what are some things what is the balance that we can implement, and that what we can do here, that reflects the will and the wishes of the people of this community, but also takes into account policy, legislation, safety across the board for the community and officers. And so I would love to just continue that conversation, but really look and target some of these specific policies and see where they might fit.
Sure. So really law and California post mandates kind of what we can do and not do.
Sure.
But I think where there's opportunity is to probably do some education in the community and with the community to let them know, hey, this is our policy, and this is what we do, and this is why we do it. This is the kind of force we might use, and
right.
That sort of thing. So, looking forward, I am looking at a couple of different programs that I think would encourage much greater community engagement with the police department. In years past, we've had Human Relations Commission here in the community, and that wasn't necessarily geared towards law enforcement and race relations. It was more geared towards race relations in the community itself.
Yeah.
But I think we may be able to apply that to a broader picture, and not only race relations in the community, but race relations between police and the community as well. I think that'd be an important conversation to start. In the years past, we've had, a Citizens Academy, and people that have gone through that, I still hear from them, that it was a really eye-opening experience, because they get oftentimes opportunities to engage in scenarios where some of these things that we just talked about might be necessary. And without the training and or expertise or experience that people have in law enforcement, they might, move to a certain level of force or do something that would violate this list. Yeah. Or, they might say, oh, well, now I get it. Now I understand why you need to be able to do this. So I think there's much more conversation to be had there, quite frankly, and not only here in Azusa, but just overall, what changes in law enforcement can be made to make people safer if we are going to use force.
Sure.
So.
Okay. I know it's 6:17. Could we get into at least a few questions from that?
Yeah, we're good. We're good.
Okay.
I'm here, Adrian.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So looks like this is a question that has come in from a lot of different people. And so how will you address systematic racism in our city, Mike, as the chief of police within the Azusa, the APD, and Adrian from your role as executive director at My Third Place? So you want to start us off? How might you, what are the ways that you might address systematic racism in our city?
Okay. So we already train a lot with our officers to try to reduce the amount of racism that might be present. And I want to make it clear, I don't think there's a racist issue with Azusa PD. I think the men and women of Azusa PD actually do very good work. And I have, in my years here, heard very, very few complaints about them. And so I don't think that it's a very prolific issue, but I do want to address it because obviously there's concern in the community, and we just want to make sure that people understand what we are doing and what we could do. So we provided additional training to our officers over and above the amount of training that's required by post. We typically do either 40 or 50 hours a year of advanced officer training, and that could be on topics relating, like I mentioned earlier, bias-based training and how to remain impartial, all the way to tactical communication, so you can de-escalate things, mental health awareness, use of force, first aid, CPR, and then each day we have a daily observation report. We have a DTB, daily training bulletin that our officers take. And many of those topics are related to what we're talking about as well. And they log in every day, and it's kind of like a daily training opportunity where people are reading our policy and getting hit with scenarios and questions related to those policies. Now, looking forward, clearly, there's conversation to be had, and I'm going to be seeking opportunities to find more training related to this topic so that my officers are that much better and trained in this area to really prevent anything that might be there, or any perceptions that might be there. Again, I don't think it's a big issue here, but are there implicit biases there that people have, and that goes both ways. We have them, and other people have them towards us. So I commit to working towards trying to find training related to that so that I could provide it to my officers moving forward. I mentioned that the Human Relations Commission, and it's been some time since we had that, and I'm going to explore trying to bring that back. And I think whether it's housed here at the PD, or if it's through City Hall, or whether it's an organic group that forms in the community and we're just part of it, I think there's an opportunity here, and we need to take that opportunity to be part of those conversations. And whether the systemic racism is here, or in the community itself, or wherever, I think any work we can do in that direction would be helpful. And these are just a couple of ideas that I've got moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. I know. I guess I could say from my perspective, even things like this, grateful to, and even to kind of explain. So what my third place is, what we do is we're a mentorship organization, and we create environments for teenagers to really grow, and more importantly, to be walked alongside with and have mentors in their lives. And we recognize just the value of having adults that are in young people's lives, speaking life and giving guidance as teenagers are needing to make decisions. And this was said at the front end of the protest, and I think it was wise that a lot of the horrific behaviors that we see people kind of engage and live out of, like racism, these are learned behaviors, and I think it's vital that some of these things be unlearned. And one of the ways that I think that can happen is in relationship. And so things that I would love to see happen. So one of the things that my third place is working on is a one-on-one mentorship program. So like having a big brother, big sister program that's here and in place, so that again, you have impressionable young people who are being walked alongside by other people within our community. That's something that we're working towards. Even looking with PD, something that I've had conversations with a previous police chief about, and we never really got it off the ground, is what would it look like to have some sports engagements, and maybe some sports teams and interactions with PD and other first responders, and maybe other leaders within our community, and creating some sort of like whether it's a one-off game, or it's just something that happens regularly, a tournament of sorts, where you can, it allows for some of the young people here in our community to develop some of those relationships with PD. In the past, I know we held a fireside chat where we invited the previous police chief to come and speak to some of our young people, and some of our young people said they didn't want to come. If the police are going to be here, we don't want to be here. And so we were able to talk to some of them, and they were able to be there and engage and interact and kind of bridge some of those divides, because like we're afraid of what we don't know. And so if there are things that they are, have grown to believe, or negative experiences that they've had, looking for ways to counteract that with positive experiences. And so my third place, we're committed to continue to be a conduit, and continue to kind of think through and flesh out some of these innovative ideas, and find ways for the community to come together. And even things like this, this is our first. I hope we can do others. This doesn't have to be our last time doing something like this.
Yeah, I agree. And obviously I want to continue working with you, Adrian, and trying to make things better and find innovative ways to do it. The sports thing, sometimes we go over to the schools and play kickball with the kids at lunch, that kind of stuff. It's we get invited, or we just show up, that kind of thing. just don't make a basketball because I'm not good at basketball. So.
Got you. Okay. Okay, I got one here. What are one or two things this is from Crystal. What are one or two things that we as regular citizens can do so that we can defeat racism in our society?
Okay, I think one or two things that we can do. So really, I mean, a lot of these conversations, what we're talking about right here, I think it's a lot of soul searching and reflection. You know, it's easy to turn away from it and not want to think about it and not talk about it, right? I think it's very important to recognize that people are different and they have different experiences and they come from different backgrounds, and that plays into everything we do, everything we decide, and how we're interacting. And I think it's important for people to recognize that and embrace it, and really, you know, try to figure out, okay, how do I learn more about Adrian and his culture and his background, and how do I apply that to what I'm doing here, to try to make the department better and to try to make the city better and to police it more effectively, because my experiences may not apply where they need to, and yours, like, you're already talking to me about some stuff, and I'm like, oh, I didn't even think of it that way. You know, it makes sense. Yeah. So, you know, I think that's probably the most effective way, is to just recognize there's differences and try to embrace them and try to be willing to have those difficult conversations.
Yeah. And I'll add to that a couple things. One, I think that a lot of isms, so if we use racism as an example, are oftentimes viewed as like a switch, like either I am racist or I am not. And it's almost like, I think people a lot of times feel the need to defend and prove, you know, I'm not racist because my friend or my brother, my sister's married to a black guy, or I love, you know, there seems to be this defense that comes up. But I believe that racism is more along the lines of on a spectrum. I think we could say the same thing of ignorance. And so there, you know, ignorance or racism or some of these other things, recognizing that they do indeed exist. And so instead of trying to prove that I'm, you know, I have no racism, like you're talking about, being more introspective to recognize to what degree are some of those racist tendencies still within me, and how can I, in essence, wage war against those things on a personal level, but two, also recognizing where those things may exist on a societal level and being willing to call those out. And that can be hard to call those things out, because again, we put each other in these categories, and sometimes to call out something racist as racist can come with accusations of being on one side of a political argument or another, as opposed to just calling wrong. So that's one thing that I would encourage, is for instead of arguing, you know, for people to argue that they are not racist, but instead acknowledge that there's racism that exists with it, you know, even if it's, you know, subconscious and whatnot. And so how do we search to find it, instead of trying to say that I don't? And then I would just say same thing, relationships. You know, you fear what you don't know. And so if you're able to, you know, it's easy to talk about those people when they're just them. But when they are no longer them, but instead, if it's, you know, if it's Mike or if it's Adrian or if it's Rob or whatever it may be, then you have firsthand understanding and knowledge, and it can bring it home for you in a different way. Let's see. It says, let's see. Can you both tell me what this is from Karen? Can you both tell me what you are doing to educate yourself on systemic injustice we're seeing?
Sure, I can start with that. So in some of the leadership classes I've taken, and some, you know, some of the schooling that I've been through, I've read books and tried to get different perspectives and understand where people come from and how they might view police or myself. As a chief, it's important that I understand as much as I can how people feel and how to effectively, you know, lead the men and women to do the job that they need to do, while trying to be sensitive to things like race or gender or you know, whatever it might be. You know, so along those lines, the reading that I've done, the conversations that I've had, I've talked with, many other more seasoned chiefs, and asked them, hey, where are we at? What's going on? How do you do this? Why do you do this? That kind of thing. And it's an evolution and ongoing learning process for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say for myself, I'm grateful to be a part of different groups locally and even nationally, where I find myself having a seat at some tables to be able to explore some of these concepts, as well as speak into these things. I think that these things are ever evolving. I'll say that the frequency of conversations that I've had with both friends of color and also just some of my white brothers and sisters around some of these conversations has increased dramatically over the course of the past couple of weeks. And on one hand, that's it can be challenging, and these are emotional conversations, but there's even learning that comes from that. And I think that there just is a responsibility that we all have to be informed, whether it's through readings and conversations. It can be tiring, especially I've talked to a lot of people who say they've been on social media and they've seen enough, they've had enough, and so they want to disconnect and disengage. But I would really encourage them to, don't rob them of opportunities to learn and to see things from perspectives that they don't hold, and don't maybe have the ability to have experienced themselves. Next question. It says, there's just a few more. It says, next question, with social media, specifically Twitter, TikTok, etc., we've been seeing lots of videos where counter protesters have been trying to incite violence while posing as protesters with BLM. They do this not only hoping to escalate the crowd, but to escalate police response. It seems like current tactics don't have a way to address this. What are your thoughts on overcoming this issue at our local, state, and national levels?
So yeah, that's a difficult one right there, right? So, as I discussed earlier, there were people present on Tuesday that were not from our community, and I got that information from community members that were part of the protest, right? And they said, yeah, I've talked to these people; they weren't from Azusa, and I don't know what their intent was. If it was, to come in, agitate things, or just simply to come and protest peacefully, but it's difficult because we really don't know. We don't know if somebody's going to come in and they're here to create chaos and to push somebody in the crowd's button enough to get them to take a step and become violent, or to push an officer so much so that the officer reacts in a way that is inappropriate. What we do is we try to learn from our experiences here in the community, right? So what we experienced Tuesday and how we reacted and what we deployed Tuesday will likely be different the next protest, because we've learned from that experience and we understand the dynamics of kind of the evolution of how things have gone over the last week or so. I'll share with you that we communicate regionally, and there have been identified groups that are traveling city to city, participating in these protests, and they're not always there to protest peacefully. Some neighboring communities have had really truly counter protest people that didn't insert them into the Black Lives Matter protest, and they showed up to counter protest that. Yeah. And that just further aggravated things and made it worse. And we try to communicate regionally and talk to one another and anticipate, okay, if this, then what? But truly, in the days or in the social media times, like word travels fast. People are all over the place. In talking with law enforcement leaders that have been working since '92, since riots after Rodney King, like these riots are completely different riots. In '92, it seemed organic and in a neighborhood, and there was not as much travel. This one and whether it's because of social media or whatever it might be, there are groups traveling throughout Southern California that are going to different protests, and whether it's to peacefully protest, to antagonize the Black Lives Matter protesters or counter protesters.
Yeah.
So we're working as much as we can to try to address that and identify it when we see it.
Yeah. Here's a quick one. What do you think of having peace officers who are not in tactical gear around to show solidarity with protesters tomorrow?
So that's part of our conversation. What are we going to do? I'll share with you on Tuesday. I wasn't out there in tactical gear. I was just standing there trying to talk to people and engage with people and, be there and be available and show support. The concern is, like we already mentioned, if some of these people, counter protesters, antagonizers, agitators, whatever they are, show up and they want to cause problems, if I have officers out there and they start throwing frozen water bottles or rocks or bricks or that kind of thing at our officers, and we don't have our gear on, we can't say time out. Let me go put my helmet on and come back. That's one of those fine lines. Luckily, like I've mentioned, it seems like the protests are moving away from that type of activity, but it's clearly documented throughout the nation that activity is taking place. And obviously we wouldn't support that.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe just a couple more. This one's a long question, but it may be a quicker response. It's from Rick. It says, there are more than two perspectives on this. When I got to Slauson Park, so it looks like in regards to Tuesday's protest, when I got to Slauson Park, there was a definite void in leadership among the marchers. If Anthony Powell had not stepped up, in all likelihood, a non-Azusan would have taken advantage. I was insecure in marching because some who led the chants were hoping for confrontation. And when they got to City Hall, immediately some went towards the officers and yelled words trying to instigate conflict. I was glad to see a police presence, not because of Azusa citizens, but because of the events in days prior nationally, where violence was instigated by those who had a different agenda, not knowing who's in the crowd and what their intentions are. I think a strong police presence was a deterrent for potential violence. So, and we kind of talked about this. I think we've already talked about this, but that's, I appreciate that. And even him talking about how there are more than two perspectives on this. I don't want in any way for this to seem like you as a police officer are speaking and the perspective, you are able to speak on behalf of the police department as the chief, but that the perspectives that you hold are necessarily all of the perspectives of all officers everywhere. And same for me. I may be a Black male, but even with that, I can't speak on behalf of all, Black folks everywhere, or minorities, or people of color, or even just people in general who have experiences. And so I think that's critical and important to remember, that there are dynamic perspectives. Okay, one more question here. There has been a video circulating around Floyd's criminal past. What are thoughts on that, and how much should that factor in, if any, when arresting someone?
I haven't seen a video circulating about Floyd's past, so I'm not sure what they're referring to. But I'll give you just my perspective on his death from 2 weeks ago. My understanding is, he tried to pass a forged $20 bill. They arrived. They tried to take him into custody, and I frankly don't know. I don't know if he had a medical emergency. I don't know. Like initially when they detained him, I saw a video of them walking him to a car, and he fell. And I don't know if that was a medical emergency. I don't know if that was passive resistance, saying you got to put me in the car, as opposed to me getting in the car. Frankly, I don't know. But the reality of it is, whether it's passing a $20 bill, or passively resisting, or actively resisting, like the actions by those officers, based on what I know, was inappropriate. Like they killed him, right? Based on what I saw in the video, it was unwarranted, unneeded, and all they had to do was turn him on his side. All they had to do was sit him up, whatever it was. And with 4 officers there, they could have done that and still maintain control of him, and wait for the ambulance to arrive, if that's what they were doing, is waiting for an ambulance to come and load him up to take him to the hospital or whatever and take him in custody. So the the criminal history, like I don't know, like it kind of goes back to the traffic stop scenario that I discussed earlier. If I stop a car, I don't know who's in the car. I don't know what their criminal history is. I don't know if they just robbed a bank around the corner. Like, I don't know that. So it really, to me, it doesn't play into the arrest and scenario too much, because for the most part, you may not know what the person's criminal history is during the interaction that you're having with them.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Okay, so again, I think just thank you. I want to thank you for taking the time, and I know we even went longer than we originally anticipated. So thank you for being flexible there. I'm glad that this is, that we're able to have this conversation, and I'm grateful that, I don't even want to call this a start. I think calling this a start wouldn't be fair, because it would almost seem to suggest that there hasn't already been conversation and collaboration that has happened from the community and the police. And so I think it'd be more fair to just say this is a great next step that I think we're engaging in, and I know that I look forward to additional next steps, whether it's the same type of format and medium. Again, working with teenagers here in the community, I'd love to even create some space to have some of the young people here in our community be able to directly speak and engage, and maybe in the hopefully in the near future that we can have a way to not have to do it over Zoom and really be able to do some of these things in person. Yeah. And so I just want to say thank you for taking the time, and I do want to acknowledge that Tuesday was complicated. Tuesday got complicated, and we had this scheduled. We talked about this since last week, and the fact that Tuesday happened, and at no point did I hear you even suggest that you wanted to cancel, or that you were going to have to pull back on it. Also, this format, the way that it happened, because I know there are some people who are saying, well, why is this happening online, and why is it happening this way? I also want to say, my third place, our team put together this format, and at no point did you push back or say no, that this, that you didn't communicate that anything was off limits. So I just want to communicate that and thank you for that, and just say that I look forward to more opportunities to grow as a community, and would love to hear if there's any other kind of lasting final thoughts that you'd like to share out, any other points of importance that you want to share with the community.
I would, and obviously thank you for the opportunity to engage and speak and address the community. That's so huge, right? And you're right, this is not a first step. Like, we've been talking and we've engaged, and anybody that lives in the community, knows the community, knows the Azusa Police Department, what we're about, and we really do all we can to try to support the community and work with the community. And the men and women of Azusa PD do a great job. They're hardworking, well trained, well prepared, and they work as much as they can to keep the community safe. And I'm proud to lead them, and proud to be their chief. So in closing, I look forward to more conversation. To the members of the community, we are here for you. I anticipate in the coming months being able to hopefully engage with community members more. It's difficult right now because we still have a pandemic, right? But as things get better, hopefully we can do some more of these community events, community meetings, and have that personal interaction, because I think that's so important. So thank you, Adrian, and thank you to Azusa and the other people that have watched.
Thank you. And how about this? Because I love having a next step kind of in place. What if we look towards, we're entering the summer. What if we look towards, before the end of summer, kind of having some sort of follow-up, whether it's another one of these, if being in person isn't doable, or doing something in person if that's feasible. But I'm good. Let's continue the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Just let me know when, and definitely willing to.
Love it. Mike, thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
All right, Adrian. Have a good night.
All right. Have a good night.